Good afternoon, Year 12. So today we're going to be talking about succession. Now, succession is the process whereby we move from a bare patch of rock to a verdant forest, or to, at the very least, the maximum possible biodiversity for an area. Now, a kind of classic example of this is like a car park at the back of your house. If it's concrete, if it's tarmac, what's going to happen if you leave it alone is that you're going to end up with grass growing in it. If you leave it long enough, you'll end up with trees growing in it, though we don't tend to leave it that long. And an even better example is something like Chernobyl power station. I'm sure you've heard of it. When it went for a nuclear disaster, really, they had to evacuate the city of Pripyat, which is right nearby. And since then, the city's been overtaken with pine trees. It's basically become a pine forest with some buildings in it. So how do we go from bare concrete or bare city to forest? That's the question. And that's what succession is. Succession always starts with some bare ground. All right. We usually think of it as rock. It can actually be something like soil left over from forest fire or something like that. But let's call it rock for now, because that's the barest you can have. Bare rock, bare concrete. Now, you might think nothing can grow on rock. Of course, if you think about it a lot, we know that's not true. If you leave rock long enough, what happens is little patches of low-lying moss start to grow on there. They float in with their spores, they land on the rock, and they grow. Now, this is an example of a pioneer species. Now, pioneer species is one of those terms you have to use when talking about succession. Pioneer species tend to be fast-growing, fast-dying, don't need many nutrients, don't need much water. They're opportunists in many ways. They turn up, they do what they do, they're gone. All right? Their aim is simply to suck up what nutrients there are and then to disappear, to die, and to reproduce. So, pioneer species arrives. Well, in arriving, the first thing it does is it digs its tiny little roots into the rocks. It can't break them per se, but it creates little tiny, usually microscopic cracks where it is in the rock. So, I'm talking microscopic. You wouldn't be able to see these cracks, but they are there. So we're creating very small cracks in the rock. And an even more important thing that it does is that when it dies, which it does, like all things do, it creates a layer of what we call humus. H-U-M-U-S, which is basically a nutrient-rich soil which is formed when things die. So if an animal or a plant dies, it leaves behind humus when it decomposes. Now, because of this slight cracks and because of these nice thick humus, that allows bigger things to come along. Now, usually that's a larger moss or a very small plant. We're going to skip a few generations though. We're going to go straight to a little flower. So we're going to imagine that there's been enough soil created by the death of the moss that we can have a little flower. All right? Now this little flower is going to do what it does. It's going to dig its roots in here. And again, because it's got slightly stronger roots, it will create even longer cracks in the bare rock. All right? Now, again, these things don't last forever. They last a little bit longer than moss. They don't last forever. And again, when they die, they are going to produce yet more humus. So we're going to end up with an even thicker layer of humus. Right, which is a nice thick layer of soil. Now, after a while, once you've gone through a few generations of moss, then a bigger moss, then an even bigger moss, then a small plant, and a bigger plant, and an even bigger plant, once you've got enough humus, you can have a little bush growing, a little shrub. Right? And that shrub is the first thing that can begin to directly break through into the rocks with its roots. Got really hard, strong roots, and so you're going to have, basically this rock is gone at this point underneath. Right? It may as well not exist anymore. It's full of holes where roots have been. But that's not the end of it, of course. Eventually, and this is where I need a brown pen but don't have one, eventually you're going to have trees forming, which are going to be the kind of final bits of succession. Right? And again, this is just as a result of things landing, things changing the conditions underneath, things adding humus, and then things dying. And that's how you end up with your forest. Now, that will not get you all the marks in your succession question. So, first things first, there is a word for this final community, the kind of what we call the maximum biodiversity. So, maximum biodiversity, i.e. the maximum number of different species available, the maximum number of different types of species, is called a climax community. Now, a climax community, as I say, occurs when you've broken up the rock to the maximum possible extent, you've got about as much soil as you're going to have, and you've got a lot of the largest organisms possible. That will depend on the size of the area. If you've got a table-sized piece of rock, you're never going to get a tree there. Max biodiversity for you will probably be some small plants. That will be the climax community for that table-sized piece of rock. If you've got a large piece of rock like we have here, you are going to get trees and shrubs, and that will be the climax community. Now, there are a few questions to be able to answer here. And the first question is, as you go from one cereal level to the next, as you go from moss to flower to bush and tree, what is happening to the hostility of the environment? What's happening to the hostility of the environment? Well, I hope you can immediately see that bare rock is more hostile for life than thick soil with trees and bushes on it. Right? So hostility has decreased as you go along. Got decreased hostility. What is happening to the stability of the environment? Again, I'm hoping that you can see very quickly that if I'm going from bare rock, where a single wave washing over will wash away everything, to thick soil with trees and bushes, where a hurricane can come along and still something would survive, that we have increased stability. So I've got increased stability. And the third question is, what has happened to biodiversity? Now, do we remember the definition for biodiversity? Biodiversity is the number of different types of species you have in an area. And I hope you can see, in going from bare rock with moss to a collection of trees, bushes, the associated animals, with small plants, ferns, ivies, etc., we have massively increased biodiversity. Now, those are three things I'd like you to mention as part of your answer about succession, and they are things people forget to say. So let's fly through this all over again. We're going to have step one, bare rock. A pioneer species comes along and settles on the bare rock. By settling there, it breaks down the rock slightly and adds small amounts of humus, which increases the stability and decreases the hostility. Now, as a result of it settling there, some plants come along and they can grow in that soil it created. It's worth noting, actually, this is a slight suicide mission because the moss can't grow on soil, and so once there is soil there, the moss cannot grow there anymore. It can only grow on bare rocks and trees. So every new species changes the environment to make it better for other species, but not for itself. In the same way, a giant bush being here will stop plants growing here, so this plant has changed the environment to make it worse for itself in many ways. But regardless, we've gone pioneer species on bare rock, increasing stability, decreasing hostility, larger species coming along, and that then increases the biodiversity. And that if you do that for many generations, you will create a climax community here. And that is succession. That is all there is to it. And if you get a 6 marker on it, as you will in just a second, one will appear on the screen, you just need to recite those points. So, now that you've seen all that, hopefully you'll feel comfortable answering this question. It's 4 marks, which is shorter than the usual ones I give you. You don't tend to see a 6 marker on succession, you tend to be more like 3 or 4. Now, all you've got to do is write down the answer to this question, and that will be the end of this video. I'll give you 30 seconds, I'll give you several minutes to do that if you pause me, and then we'll go through the answer. So, A, right, colonization by pioneer species. So pioneer species. Now, you get a mark for using the word pioneer species. If you do not use that word, you lose that mark. Second one, pioneer species change the environment, habitat, conditions, or factors. I prefer to give an example. If you said they increase soil or humus, or you said they break down rock, then you will get that mark. Environment becomes less hostile for other new species, so decrease hostility. Environment becomes more suitable for other or new species. You could also say the word stable. And change and increase in biodiversity to a climax community. And if 4 of those 5, ideally you would write all 5. And that is the end of that. So hopefully that's helped you to understand succession. Obviously a new type of video for me today. Hopefully that's been helpful.